Thank you very much, Bill. The cost recovery might not be a huge issue for Binghamton because, as everyone knows, our roads are as smooth as glass, right? Next panelist is actually joining us remotely, and if we do have some problems with sounds, I know our technicians and engineers will try to work with us and do their best. Again, if you have any questions, just raise your hand. Join us Dr. Theo Colburn, and she is the president of the Endocrine Disruption Exchange, a world-renowned environmental health analyst. Dr. Colburn has testified before Congress regarding the possible immediate and long-term health repercussions of natural gas production. She is the author of Our Stolen Future, Are We Threatening Our Fertility, Intelligence, and Survival? And I think her discussion is extremely relevant. Again, I mean, this is an area where we have had decades of prosperity from IBM, but then we had the haunting legacy of the toxic plume. So nobody wants that to happen again. And this is a very riveting presentation. And so Dr. Colburn, if we can give her a round of applause, thank her for joining us.
Well, all right. You can go to the next picture right away. Okay. This is a picture looking up the Colorado River as it flows from the mountains to the southwest. From the ground, the extent of this activity is missed. Perhaps that is one of the reasons why development like this could expand so rapidly along this freshwater artery that serves an estimated 25 million people downstream. It was out of sight of those who ultimately could be affected. Nonetheless, we have learned in the West that once the natural gas delivery pipelines are in place, this kind of rapid development cannot be stopped. Now, let's shift to the chemicals that are also out of sight in this picture that played a part in changing this landscape. Click. In order to handle the long list of products used to produce natural gas in Colorado, we listed them in an Excel spreadsheet, and when the information was available, we added the names of the chemicals in the products as well. Next, we added what information we could find about the health effects of the chemicals. Once the data was systematically organized, a consistent pattern kept popping up of health effects, broken into standard toxicological health categories used by government health agencies. The last time that this program was updated for Colorado, there were 215 products and 278 chemicals on the list. These chemicals are used during drilling, fracking, and the process, and as well as the processing of the gas. Click. 93% of the chemicals had known health effects. The other 7% represents the products for which we had no information at all because it was either listed as proprietary or there was no information because the chemical was unidentifiable. Click. Of those products that had health effects, 19% had 1 to 3 effects and 81% had 4 to 14 effects. Click. And what surprised us was to find that 42% of the products on our list for Colorado are endocrine disruptors. In other words, they contain chemicals that can interfere with the development of individuals before they are born and cause irreversible lifetime changes in how they function. Wildlife, including fish and birds, have proven to be sensitive to chemicals of this nature at very low concentrations in the environment. Click. We then broke out the most mobile chemicals by their major pathways of exposure. And here you see the frequency or percent of chemicals that are associated with the health categories listed across the bottom of the graph. Now, from left to right, that's skin and eye and sensory organ damage, respiratory damage, gastrointestinal and liver, neurological, cardiovascular, immune, ecological. Those are the chemicals that we know can affect the invertebrates in the field and other animals, kidney, reproductive, developmental, and cancer way over on the right. Now, some of you saw the New Mexico list like this for the solubles, and cancer didn't make it on the list in New Mexico. For example, of the 124 water-soluble chemicals used in Colorado, better than 85% of them can cause skin and eye and sensory organ irritation, and damage. The height of the bars represents the percent of chemicals on the list that can and are associated with particular health category. The effects in those categories on the left are more likely to be experienced upon immediate exposure, such as mild to serious damage to skin, eyes, sinus, nose, throat, coughing, causing breathing problems, asthma, nausea, and immediate neurotoxic effects ranging from headaches, blackouts, dizziness, memory loss, confusion, and fatigue that after prolonged or repeated exposure can lead to permanent neuropathies. Some of the chemicals have been identified as sensitizers because they have a tendency to cause allergies. A lower percent of the chemicals on the right can cause disorders that develop slowly, such as immune disorders, cardiovascular, kidney, reproductive organ damage, and cancer that may not be expressed until years later. Click. We also looked at the chemicals that are volatile, those chemicals that could escape and get into the air and would be capable of reaching more people sooner than the water-soluble chemicals. Here you see a similar pattern, but with greater frequency than the water-soluble chemicals. Even among the categories that include the long-term chronic disorders, such as kidney disorders, you see that jumped quite higher, that increased with age. It would be very difficult for medical practitioners to say with confidence that chemical X caused disorder X, and especially where aggregate exposure is taking place. And there would be no reason for physicians to even link the health problems they see in their patients in the office to industrial gas production, unless they are alerted to it and they begin to see a lot of cases at one time. Click. From here on, we will look at some activities on the ground where chemicals are being used. This is the Divide Creek well pad in Garfield County that has been active for many years. When we flew over it, we were surprised to see that a new well was being drilled on the pad because several years ago, methane began escaping from underground and bubbling up in the creek that you can see in the background. Now, at this point, I'm going to start pointing out another problem with natural gas that is also out of sight. The problem of fugitive methane, or natural gas, escaping during all stages of production and delivery. There are new technologies available to reduce this problem and should be installed during the development stages of production and not try to Rube Goldberg them later. That's never as effective. Also, the release of airborne volatile chemicals called VOCs that I mentioned earlier can be measured in the air around all stationary equipment and well pads like this that are used to produce gas. The methane does not come up from the ground alone. A well-known group of other pollutants that come up with the gas as well includes benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylene. They are better known as BTEX, BTEX. And unlike methane, they are toxic. Now click. Let's go down and take a closer look at this pad. Here you can see a reserve pit with two sections to the left of the drill rig, very close to the drill rig. I'm looking at the picture. I wish I could point to it for you as well. That is collecting materials coming up from the ground as the well is being dug. One side is for the cuttings that come up in the pipe, and the other for the water and returning drilling mud. Now keep in mind that most often the gas does not come up dry, and that water has to be removed from the gas before it enters the delivery pipe. So that larger pit, the blue-colored water of material in that pit, holds what is called the condensate water that is removed from the gas here at the wellhead. Click. I have squeezed a lot of information on this slide to save time. This is an artist's conception of what involves fracturing a well. In order to facilitate the release of the gas from underground, a process called fracturing or fracking is employed to increase the well's productivity. The industry recently started to use the word stimulation to describe the process. During fracking, fluids under extremely high pressure are introduced at various depths underground. Notice the drill rig's gone. You don't see it in the picture anymore. causing what the industry describes as mini earthquakes. In each frac, as much as 1 million gallons of fluid can be injected underground under extremely high pressure. Now, in this artist's conception, you can see to the left of the borehole a huge compressors on trucks in order to sustain the pressure throughout the process that can take as long as 36 hours. These compressor vehicles depend upon a constant supply of diesel fuel throughout the operation. Also depicted there are some huge tanks to show that a lot of diesel is used during this operation. During fracking, numerous chemicals in various combinations are also added to the fluids that are injected underground. The chemicals, as described in the commercial literature, range from surfactants, lubricants, foamers, proppants, plastics, some for bulk and weight, biocides, antioxidants, and concentrated acids and alkalis. To the right of the picture, you see a lot of what are called fracking tanks. They're usually on wheels, and they're lined up to provide the water for the process and also to be available to accept the fluids when they return to the surface. Now, a great deal of fugitive methane, diesel exhaust that produces nitrogen oxides, and VOCs are again released during this operation. And one well may be fracked as much as 10 times using the latest technology, and at each depth, the borehole can be perforated every 60 degrees, allowing the explosion to extend out in 6 directions from the bore. And that crack, those black lines near the bottom, can extend out approximately 2,000 feet in each direction. Now, from now on, also I want to point out that the nitrogen oxides, NOx, plus VOCs, plus sunlight, then in the presence of sunlight, then cook in the air and produce ozone. And from here on, I'm going to repeatedly talk to you about ozone, this other problem which is out of sight and off of most of the public health authorities' radar. We need ozone in the stratosphere to protect us from ultraviolet light, but down here at ground level, it poses an almost invisible health problem. 1 molecule of ozone can burn a hole in the deep alveolar tissue in your lungs. The lungs do not have the ability to repair this cell damage. Continued daily exposure to ozone leads to early aging of the lungs. They become brittle and dry out. Prenatal exposure leads to low birth weight, increased preterm birth, and asthma in children and adults. And later in life, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and other lung and pulmonary disorders. Ozone was always thought to be an urban problem caused by the nitrogen oxides, the NOxes, from automobiles' exhaust, and VOCs from gasoline fumes. We have created west of the Rocky Mountains a growing urban-like ozone or smog problem as a result of the exponential growth of natural gas production. Now, Roger mentioned that it is the collective impact that we have to worry about, and this definitely is one of those collected impacts that has not been anticipated in the West, and it doesn't sound like you're anticipating it in the East. And both with drilling and fracking, because once the operation starts, it cannot be stopped. There will be lots of noise and light around the clock, because it takes about 36 hours to do a frack. This is what fracking actually looks like from the sky. There are 8 wells already on this pad. You see the 8 produced water tanks over on the left. I was able to count 10 huge compressor trucks, 35 fracking tanks alone along the left side of the activity. These fracking tanks are about the size of a freight car with vents on top and hoses coming out of the bottom. Now, estimates range from 30 to 70% of the fluids injected underground during fracking are recovered. That's about 300,000 to 700,000 gallons of contaminated fluids resurfacing. Depending on the operation, this fluid is re-injected on site or hauled off to be re-injected at a central site or piped to another site for injection or put in open evaporation pits. Click. In order to get the gas from the pad into the delivery system, it is essential to maintain a pressure in those short pipelines. greater than the pressure in the main delivery line. Here you see a compressor station. They come in all sizes and shapes, with its huge fans serving 500 to 1,500 horsepower engines that are run on diesel or partially polished natural gas. At this point, the gas has to be compressed up to 500 psi in order to exceed the 400 psi that is used in the commercial pipeline. Now, I'm going to skip down then. Then I'll skip on. Go to the next one. Before the gas finally enters the national commercial pipeline, it has to be polished once more. This is the Ignacio Ute Reservation natural gas refinery that releases huge volumes of foul-smelling volatile compounds around the clock, and it has its own very large evaporation pit. Click. Up to several months ago, this waste handling facility accepted trucks loaded with fluids from gas producers from a radius of 50 miles or more. Little or no chemical monitoring was done on what was unloaded here. It was shut down recently, and today 1 truck a minute is leaving Colorado on Interstate 70, going as far as 100 miles one way to unload contaminated wastewater in a new open pit in Utah. When pits like these dry down to nothing but an oily residue, the sludge is then hauled off to a chemical land farm, where it is disked into the soil and allowed to dry. From what we know about the chemicals that are found in some evaporation pits, we wonder if any vegetation could ever survive in the soil. Quite a few of the products on our list contain microfine silica and other finely ground material, which when the residue dries, it could readily be picked up by the wind as dust. And silica especially can lodge deep in the alveoli in the lung and cause silicosis. And fine dust particles with ozone produce smog. Click. TEDx got an urgent request to see if we had any information about the chemicals in 20 products that had been used during a drilling operation in Wyoming that had run into trouble. The MSDSs were being FedExed to us overnight because people living nearby were complaining about their health and were unable to go outside. The well blew out during a routine drilling operation at a depth of 8,000 feet, where the drillers hit a strata of extremely high pressure and a lot of muds and gases began to blow back up. It took 57 hours to get it under control. Fortunately, in this case, the company involved agreed to give the local authorities a chance to the names of the products that they had been using. And here you can see our results. Click once more. In closing, let's look at what we discovered when we were sent the test results from 6 New Mexico evaporation pits that are scheduled to be shut down in the near future. The health categories of the 42 chemicals that were detected in the pits produced the highest frequencies we have seen yet. In addition, some of the chemicals were found at extremely high concentrations and well above state and federal safety levels. What struck us was that most of the chemicals they reported in the pits did not match the chemicals in our spreadsheet. These were entirely different chemicals. We asked to see the chemical testing protocols used to detect the chemicals in the pits and found that except for one chemical, they did not test for the other chemicals on the list. Okay, we found that over 90% of the chemicals reported in the pits are on the government's CERCLA or Superfund list of toxic chemicals, the EPCRA list and the EPCRA list of lists. These are the government's most critical list of toxic chemicals. Now, findings such as this raise a number of questions that only adequately designed testing requirements and protocols and comprehensive monitoring programs can be addressed, and also reinforces the need for full disclosure of all the chemicals and other ingredients that come in the product containers. Thank you. I'll quit there.
Bruce Basil, who was also at that forum in Liberty earlier this summer, he seems to be racking up a lot of frequent flyer miles coming from Colorado to New York, 3 visits, I think, in the last few months. He's a staff attorney at Oil and Gas Accountability Project. He's nationally recognized expert in the field of natural gas production and regulation. Basil has drafted and negotiated landowner mineral owner bills in Colorado and New Mexico, advised many local governments on drafting local oil and gas ordinances, participated in reviewing and updating oil and gas regulations in Arkansas, Colorado, and New Mexico, and was recently invited to present testimony to the Committee on Environmental Protection of the New York City Council about the potential impacts of gas drilling around the watershed that supplies drinking water for New York City. I think what's interesting in his work with the Colorado legislator, a lot of the changes they made were reactive changes to problems that they experienced. We are fortunate that we're at the front end of this, and so I'd like to give a warm welcome to Bruce Basil.
I thought it would be helpful, as I've been listening both this afternoon and this evening. We talked with some municipal folks this afternoon. It became clear to me as I think back on the work, particularly the last 5 years that I've been doing, that there's some themes that have come up here, and I wanted to sort of use our experience in other states to illustrate some of the themes that I'm hearing. As indicated in that somewhat overly long bio of my work, a lot of it lately has been rulemaking and legislative in nature, and the issues that you've heard discussed up here about the limits on what local government can do as opposed to what state government can do, that's happened before. And I think you'll find pretty much throughout the country that in terms of this industry in particular, there really isn't much regulation in the sense of environmental and health regulation that comes from the federal level. And it's really been at the state level where there's been regulation, and local governments haven't been, and individual citizens have not been in the mix. And what we've seen happen in various states is that as gas development in particular intensifies in areas where it hasn't been before, that there's no one really addressing the kinds of impacts that Theo has talked to you about, that Bill talked about in terms of the traffic. And so it has been at meetings like these where people have said, look, it's not that we're necessarily against development of this resource, it's that there are impacts that are not being addressed. They're affecting our lives. So my initial work was actually with landowners, with surface owners, and you're fortunate here in that it seems as though many of you who are landowners also still own your mineral rights. In many states to the west, that's not the case. So you would have a drilling company show up and you had no idea what they were doing there because you didn't own your mineral rights. Well, so that started some neighbor-to-neighbor problems between the operators and the surface owners. So in a couple of states, we had to go in and take what was not a good situation in statute and get it changed. And it came from meetings like this, where people get together, talk about, look, it's not that I want to say no, it's that I want some say in where you drill, how you're going to drill, and you have to talk to me because I have to live with this for 20 to 30 years. That's about the time frame you'd be looking at if this shale development goes forward. So that was sort of the initial entry point for me into, okay, we don't like the way things are now, and we have limitations on us because of the way the statute's set up. The only way you're going to get around that, and some of the messages earlier, is if you folks that are here that are concerned about this say, okay, we need to change this, and here are some of the things. And you're fortunate in that you have people here with expertise who can say, well, here are some of the issues you need to think about as you move forward into this. The second area where we've been working a lot has been with local government. And you heard about the restrictions in New York. The other end of the spectrum is Texas. Fort Worth actually, they have very strong home rule. They do cradle-to-grave regulation. It's not always very good, and my colleagues were just down there last week at a meeting exactly like this. People were talking about the issues they have with traffic, the number of trucks, how they're going to move the fluids, the gas from the well to the compressors. Are they going to use plastic pipe or metal pipe? What kind of setbacks are they going to have from apartment buildings? Currently there's no restriction on how close a well can be to an apartment building. So I guess that's good news, bad news. You're not alone in thinking about these issues, but that doesn't necessarily mean that somebody else has solved the problem for you somewhere else. You're going to have to decide how you speak up and who you push to address this problem. And I guess that's the other big issue that I'd like you to be thinking about. Is it something you want to, in the West, there's a pretty strong culture. A lot of the folks I work with are cattle ranchers, grow alfalfa, things like that. That was initially all we worked with at first, some Native American tribes. The last 2 years, what we've been working with has been rural, I would say rural subdivision type areas. And that has really changed the political equation. But what it's also done is it's brought local government back into the equation as well. And there's been a willingness to say somebody in government, and we know our local officials best, needs to step up and help us with this. And if they don't have the authority to do it, and we need to make some changes, then we have to mobilize with them and tell our next level up in government that they need to make these changes. And so that's what we've just spent 2 years doing, particularly in Colorado. And exactly the kind of issues that you saw on Bill's list of the things that state government needs to either address themselves or give local government the authority to address, items exactly like that. And that in terms of your generic impact statement, what are you going to do about wildlife? It's hunting season out where I am. Well, actually, it's a break between hunting seasons. That's big business for us out there. Some of my best friends are outfitters, take people out. There are some folks up north that finally had to give up their outfitting license because the number of drill sites in there was making it so the deer and elk either didn't want to be there or the hunters didn't want to be there when the industrial activity was going on. So it's been this coming together of what usually would be sometimes not so harmonious rural residents, retirees, outfitters, ranchers saying, okay, we don't like the structure as it is now. These are issues for us. We have to speak up and make it happen. You are fortunate here in that it is early in the process. You don't have, as far as I know, no Marcellus shale wells here in New York yet. There are, to the west of you, there are some happening. You will hear industry spent probably a couple $1 million trying to weaken or defeat the rules that we just got passed. Monday was the last day of the state agency deliberations. In New Mexico, when we tried to change the law there, they spent close to $1 million also. So you need to expect that it's not going to be easy, but the gas is not going to go anywhere. We've heard endless times, oh, if you put these rules in, if you make us do these things, we're going to leave. We're going to go somewhere else where it's easier to work. That may be the case, but in the energy world that we're in now, I can tell you they will be back. So on the one hand, don't believe them when they say they're going to leave, but on the other, remember that at some point you're going to have to deal with some of these impacts. And they'll either be regulated or not, depending on what you ask your elected officials to do. And if your local officials are saying, we don't have authority to do some of these things, then you have to step it up to the next level and say, okay, who does, what do we need to change, and let's get on with it. Because these are going to be very real impacts that we face. As you think about making scoping comments, and I'm sure you will all do so, there are some things that we found that it would be useful to ask either your agent, whichever level of government you are in discussion with, to consider. The fact that New York City has a concern about their watershed is a big positive for you. I understand there's a history with upstate, downstate, and all that. But the reality is that they will get Albany's attention. And they're very concerned about drilling in the watershed. Now, there's a downside, I can tell you, with a 10,000-pound gorilla in the room, is that sometimes that means things get pushed off elsewhere. But I think in terms of thinking about, are there areas that are so important because they're municipal watersheds or very critical for other reasons, should there not be any drilling in those areas? And I can tell you there are municipalities much smaller than New York City out west that have done exactly that. They've said, we can't afford to have you mess up our water supply. And you're an industrial activity, spills happen, accidents happen, it's nothing intentional necessarily, but we cannot afford to have you mess that up. So therefore, and they've gotten the state's support, you cannot drill in these areas, and they're drawn on the map now. Associated with that is baseline testing ahead of time for water, and that would be both for quantity and for quality. I can't tell you how many times I've heard that somebody's well has been messed up either from the pressure or either from a fracture job or from the drilling itself, but they don't have the baseline information on what it was like beforehand to be able to then say, okay, and now it's different. And increasingly we're seeing states requiring the companies then to have the responsibility to do that testing ahead of time. And in Pennsylvania they actually have a nice provision that kind of encourages that. As Theo's presentation should have made clear to you, this is not benign stuff that's left behind. This is waste. It needs to be, and it can be legally classified as hazardous waste if it leaves that well site. So it should be handled properly. It should not be left on site. And that has been industry practice in the West. I think we're finally getting a handle on that. But that site, if they leave that stuff, that means you can't build a house on it. You shouldn't get into it with a backhoe and mess into it later. You shouldn't have livestock getting into it. You shouldn't have your kids playing on it. So it should not be left there. And essentially, the practice has been leave these little mini dumps all over, usually from drill pits, and just cover them over, and it's okay. Every time we've gotten sampling done, it has been above health standards. So they've got to handle their waste properly, and you need to insist on that. They can do development in a phased manner, meaning if it's going to happen, does it need to happen everywhere at once? Lightly, then more intensively they fill in? Or can they move across the landscape in a more orderly, planned manner? An individual company, I think you'll find, will sometimes sign agreements that will do that. The trick is going to be getting the companies, they don't work together very well. They are competitive. And so if you have more than one company drilling in an area, getting them to sit down and commit, not just say they will, but actually commit to moving through in an orderly manner, which makes your governmental infrastructure questions much easier to handle. It means you can monitor as you go to make sure there aren't impacts going off in terms of toxicity and things like that in the water. It can be done, but you really have to push hard to get them to work together. My last point, I was listening to your, I think it's the DEC commissioner testify down in New York City, and I believe he said they have 18 staff statewide. And then I saw in the New York Times this morning as I was coming up that there are likely going to be budget cuts. And I put those two together and I said, okay, you've got proposed increase in gas development, who's going to pay for the staff to deal with that? I don't have an answer for that, but it seems to me it raises a question that needs to be answered, and in terms of your comments to the state, how are they going to fund the increased staff they're going to need to handle this kind of drilling? And I'm not sure, as I say, I don't have an answer, but it certainly raised that question for me, given what I heard him say about the number of staff. I'm sure you have lots of questions, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
First question, and this is, I am instructed to poll each panel member on the question of all things considered, is our community better off with gas drilling development or without it? Started with an easy one.
I think I ask myself that every day as I work on this issue. If it were my preference, I think we'd all be better without. But I don't think that is the reality, and that at this point I will be dedicated to making sure that it's done correctly. But it's a Hobbesian choice, isn't it? And I understand from talking with a lot of folks in the surrounding area of Binghamton, you're really facing this in a very serious way, and I'm not sure. I'll put it that way.
Well, I guess as I hear Theo Colburn talk about the chemicals and you know, the other issues about the damage to our aquifers and the radioactivity and the great cost. You know, I don't think we have all the information yet, but I think that there is a lot of information to suggest that the costs are greater than any benefits.
As a planner, I'm stuck between anti-development and development, so I see it from both sides. I would prefer not to have it. I grew up in the Catskill Mountain area, came back to my home, but the reality is the state needs it, and right now with the revenue issues that the state's facing, and if the economy swings around, the state's going to look at it as a future source of revenue, and so are municipalities. So the question is, given the realities, and Roger just touched on them as well, why not be able to do it responsibly? And I guess where I get frustrated is that as a planner looking at this and trying to address this responsibly, I get angry when I'm told that, well, the questions you're raising, you just don't want to happen, and you basically want to not have property owners pursue their dream, and that's not true. Development is a reality, so are local revenues, new revenue sources, but why not do it responsibly and address some of these issues and move forward in a progressive way?
As a visitor, I never answer that question yes or no, because I don't think that's my position. I live with gas development where I am now. I feel like I believe in people to make informed decisions, and if they do in fact get full information and decide that yes, they would like to proceed with gas development, then I support them in that. But I believe it has to be informed consent if they want to do that, and so that my goal in my work is to make sure that folks have the information they need to make good decisions, and I believe then we live with the consequences based on that.
Thank you. The next question, what kind of impact will hydraulic drilling have on our local water supplies? Will using the water in the river change it forever? Will our well water be safe to drink? Will the Susquehanna still be a river by the time drilling is complete? Dr. Colburn, you want to take a crack at that one?
Well, I would have loved to have taken a crack at the last one.
Oh, well, go ahead. I'm sorry. My mistake.
You have even begun to look into the social problems that are involved. I was going to, if I had time, I was going to show you a 400-bed man camp to house the men that are doing this work, that work 12 hours on, 12 hours off, 30 days in a row, and then get a little time off and come back to those well pads and work. You totally missed what happens in the municipalities. Life changes. There's a whole change in the community. Methamphetamine moves in. We haven't even got into the issues that follow the people that do the work. As far as I'm concerned, I think any community that can avoid this is lucky, but we're not going to avoid it, and that's why I'm making as much noise as I do. I couldn't even begin to guess what could happen to the Susquehanna River, and I don't think any of us can. we're all sitting here wondering what's happening to the Colorado River. Like someone said earlier, it's like a game of Russian roulette. There are going to be accidents. There are going to be spills. There's going to be that one time when something goes wrong. And if it happens to be the aquifer that you're living near or you're dependent upon, no one knows. I think you have a lot more water in the Susquehanna River that could be drawn out of the river without causing a depletion downstream. But in Colorado, we've already been told over the last 2 years, and we've had 2 wet years, that the amount of water leaving Colorado flowing into Utah under the Colorado River Compact Agreement has dropped considerably. Now, we don't know, but I can take you out and show you trucks that are backed up to the Colorado River and to a number of the major and minor tributaries that flow into the Colorado River that are sucking that water up day after day, and there doesn't seem to be any accounting for that going on. That's a very big issue that you need to look into back there. Don't let that get away from you like it has out here in the West.
I think that what is going to happen depends on each of us. So we have to work to make it happen the way we want to see it happen.
I'm actually going to combine some of these questions that are asking about different technical fixes. One is the solution to have the DEC mandate using alternative fracking substances, green fracking fluids. Are you familiar with the closed loop system? What impacts does that have on environment and health? And how often? No, that'll do for now.
There are some companies that claim they use green frac fluids, Anadarko for one. We have not been able to document what they are using and whether that would be something that could in fact be called green. So as far as my organization goes, we're certainly open to discussing that, but we have not yet seen a way of certifying. What do you certify as being green? So I don't see that we've, as a practical matter, have gotten into any detailed discussion about that because we just haven't seen that it's a real possibility yet. Yes, closed loop systems. Yes, they're used extensively throughout the country. The only reason not to use them is because it's cheaper to use a pit. And if you are forced to pay full cost as well as for any liability for cleanup if you have spills, in fact, it's cheaper to use a closed loop system than it is to use a pit in your drilling system. In New Mexico, they require a closed loop increasingly in different places. And what the companies are telling the agency there is that, in fact, they're saving money by doing that rather than using a pit drilling system.
Dr. Colburn, did you want to?
Yes, because last week I had a look at one of these systems that's called closed loop, where they have set up a receiving pit, and from each well pad, as the water is condensed, it's piped to or trucked to through this central unit, where, but most of it's coming in by pipe, where they can still separate off a lot of oily compounds, the oils. They kept describing it as the oils. And they make money on those oils. So they collect those oils and take them off and resell them. But in the end, there is still water left. And when I asked where the water was going, they had to admit that they were trucking it all the way out to Utah, which means then it was going to sit in this open pit out there, and then the residuals in that eventually are going to be land farmed. So whether you have a closed system or not does not always mean that it's going to be kept underground, unless that everything that they collect, that waste, is re-injected underground. And I understand that is going on somewhere. So there are huge centers that are receiving injection material now to be re-injected underground. So there are two ways to look at it. Do we want it underground where we don't know what it's doing? We don't know how long it's going to stay there. Is it deep enough that it will never affect what we are concerned about or not? That's the big question there. But in the end, in some closed-loop systems, there's still going to be land farming in the end, ultimately.
I would like to say that there is an Assembly bill. It is Assembly Bill 11606. Felix Ortiz introduced that would mandate non-toxic fracking fluids. And we certainly would support that. But even if we have the greenest, most non-toxic of materials going in, we still have rather toxic materials coming out. And the brine waters affect water bodies significantly. They're difficult to remediate through wastewater treatment systems, and we have condensate from, oil and gas products, and Theo, of course, can talk better to that on BTEX and other things. So we're still getting a rather toxic product coming out, and all the problems associated with its disposal. And I would suggest that the DEC is looking very seriously at injection wells, like Theo just mentioned, as a potential primary means of disposal. And in fact, what probably things will look like as a company develops multiple drill pad sites, they will try to locate a deep injection well 10,000 feet below the surface and put all the production waste there, rather than currently they would have to truck it out of state to Pennsylvania, to Franklin or Warren, where there are already overcapacity wastewater treatment facilities. So it's a real problem. Green fracking fluids is a step in the right direction, and closed loop systems are as well, but it doesn't get us to the full solution.
May I add something there?
Yes.
Many years ago, when they were shutting down Rocky Mountain Arsenal, this was, all the nerve gases and nasty chemicals and pesticides they had been producing that were so harmful. They injected them underground, and they injected so much underground in that particular area that they began to have earthquakes under Denver, and Denver lost its aquifer. And that, of course, led to this need for trans-mountain diversion of water from the western slope to Denver. But so these, injection still creates problems underground that no one can anticipate. No one ever expected that to happen. So it's just something to think about.
Do any of the panelists have a success story of citizen action related to this? And linked to that, what should local people do to protect themselves? What kinds of specific actions would you recommend?
I think the one success story is the fact that that we got the supplemental generic environmental impact statement. I mean, I would have preferred that the governor not sign the bill, but he did, but he required an update. So I think that was a good thing, considering the fact, let's be honest, this bill was fast-tracked. And in the 11th hour, we were finally doing the mathematics going, whoa, something's going on here. And through us, we got the towns together to really begin to digest this and mobilized our towns to pass resolutions, to send them on to our assembly person and our state senator. And so I think from that angle, we prevailed, considering where it's going to go. As we move forward, become a student of the Supplemental Generic Environmental Impact Statement. Learn a little bit more about the seeker process. You can go to the website, seek out resources through your planning departments or your university, because where change comes, change doesn't come from within governments or existing institutions. It comes from outside, and it's got to come from the communities, because the elected officials listen to the individuals that have serious concerns, and it's got to come from you, and that's where really it should come from. And citizenship requires being educated on the issues, and it's a dedication. It's a dedication. That's what it is, and that's really what this is going to require.
Anyone else want to respond?
Bruce, why don't you tell them what happened in Colorado?
Well, we had an oil and gas act very similar to yours. There was no mention of health or environment or wildlife. The your Oil and Gas Bureau would have been required to consider. And it took, several years, but in fact, then a little over a year ago, the Oil and Gas Act was amended, and to say that as they were considering development of the state's resources and oil and gas, they had to consider health, environment, and wildlife. And the rules that I mentioned that we finished up Monday with the last of the deliberations, that's the last of the essentially DEC considering, our version of DEC, considering the rules that would implement that statute. And I wouldn't say that in every aspect they are the strongest rules in the country, but I will say it's the first time wildlife has been mandated to be considered in the country when you permit for a well for a state. And we do have some chemical disclosure required. We have forced them to clean up after themselves to certain health standards. So there are some elements there that I would say, yeah, I'll be happy to talk to my grandkids about that. But it takes a lot of work, and you really got to step up and make yourselves heard to do that.
Yes. I'll just add one. I said I wasn't going to mention this, but it's getting late. A lot of people have left. So I think another small success story is this right here. Here's a ragtag citizens coalition who, through the Herculean efforts of a couple people, was able to bring these experts together and share some information both here in the public and with municipal leaders in a special session. Here's the funny thing is I have been harassed and bullied for the last 36 hours by a lawyer representing gas companies. And this is fun. I mean, this was put together by $5 and $10 donations, and here is the wealthiest industry in the world charging us of obstructing their access to municipal leaders because we wouldn't let them come to the afternoon session. I think that's telling. If that's not a responsible partner sign. What should have been done is also they sent landmen through here trying to get as many people signed up for $50 an acre. That's not a responsible partner. We have to hold them accountable. We have to hold our elected officials accountable. And so we can do this in a responsible manner.
Thanks. Is the DEC planning on creating more enforcement positions? Does the DEC have enough boots on the ground to handle this? Am I asking a rhetorical question?
No. No, they don't. I mean, we have a real crisis here, and I think it's also a crisis for the industry. I mean, there's a hiring freeze right now. There'll be budget cuts. And a great deal of the DEC staff is now working on the draft supplemental environmental impact statement. We have inspectors in the field, and oil and gas wells are being drilled as we speak in other formations, not horizontal, and inspections will go forward. I mean, Pete Granis, our commissioner, the Department of Environmental Conservation commissioner, has suggested that the pace of development is only as fast as the number of inspectors they have. And I think the industry is concerned. I think that they would like to see greater staffing so that these permits can be applied. I think we're a little cautious, at least the environmental community. We feel that the pace will continue, and I think work will get shoddier. You know, and I think the DEC, we have a good DEC. We have a good department in comparison with other states. But I think it is a real problem, and we have been looking at strategies. If this is going to go forward, there should be a heavy severance tax on the oil and gas industry as it comes out of the pipes, that a certain percentage will go into the Environmental Protection Fund, will go towards funding enforcement, funding towards land acquisition, funding towards other environmental programs. But it's kind of a dance with the devil too, and it's a difficult one. But at this point, I think the oil and gas industry feels that it's not to their advantage that the DEC has this staffing crisis as well. So it goes both ways.
Since you mentioned that, Dance with the Devil, I have to ask this question together with another question. The general question is this. In what way will tapping domestic energy resources by corporate extraction free the U.S. from energy dependence on foreign sources? Is gas cheaper in Texas? The piggyback, which is only for Roger, I think, you were waiting for this, right? I know that Carl Pope from the national branch of the Sierra Club is supportive of the Pickens Plan. You'll probably have to explain what that is. Are more regional chapters like the Atlantic chapter challenging this?
I'll briefly describe the Pickens Plan. Our executive director, Carl Pope, has seemed to embrace it, embrace the plan. Essentially, T. Boone Pickens, he's an old oil and gas man. He owns considerable reserves in Texas of natural gas. I don't think this is entirely altruistic, but the plan is essentially take all the natural gas that would be dedicated to electrical generation. We use considerable amounts of natural gas for electrical generation. Turn it into compressed natural gas to run our cars off of, and then use wind and solar to run our electrical grid, and therefore displacing coal and oil and gasoline, essentially. The Sierra Club, the National Sierra Club, is very concerned about global warming. They see natural gas as a transitional fuel that can at least bridge us from coal and oil to solar and wind. It's a difficult position for me to be in. I'm a lobbyist that represents the chapter. The chapter feels differently. While we can appreciate the goals of global warming, it's very difficult. And we are a volunteer-led organization of 42,000 members. We have members in the city that are very concerned about the watershed and are pushing bans. We have members out in Western New York that are tremendously concerned about the landscape impacts and what will become of our fine Western New York agricultural pastoral communities. And there are economic benefits, there are global warming implications, but I think the chapter at this point is wrestling with its obligations to the natural chapter and our gut feeling about how to protect this state. So it's a very nuanced position, but every major national environmental group is wrestling with this as well. And I hope that answers the question.
Good job. Then there's the more general question. Will tapping domestic energy resources by corporate extraction free us from energy dependence on foreign sources? Is gasoline cheaper in Texas? I think the first question was the primary one.
In terms of natural gas as opposed to gasoline, other than what we produce ourselves, which is declining, we get quite a bit from Canada, and we also get liquefied natural gas. I think the actual production amount for natural gas in the country actually went up last year, in part because of the shale gas that's being tapped, Barnett and Fayetteville. As far as gasoline goes, I mean, that's a whole, I think, much more complex question. We get about 20% of our oil for gasoline also from Canada, and it comes from a source up in Alberta that's very difficult up there for the people that are impacted. So there are lots of issues associated with that, but natural gas and gasoline, other than some price connection, there's not a lot. They come from different sources, so it's hard to compare.
Okay, I have a few questions related to landowners. What protection will there be for those who own small tracts of land, those who are unwillingly included, and renters, both urban and rural, who find their water quality is ruined? And how often does the gas drilling process result in toxic drinking water in private wells?
I mean, I'll speak for New York State. The DEC has maintained that for the past say 30 years, I mean, they have 14,000 active wells and not one instance of groundwater contamination. So it's difficult to say through this hydrofracking process, and most of these wells obviously are horizontal hydrofracking. They stand by this reputation, and I have to say I've scoured case files, and they have violations, but it's difficult to find examples in New York of this process of groundwater contamination. I will say that it's anecdotal. They don't do background testing. A lot of these wells have been developed in rural districts, and it's a little cynical for them to ride on this record when proof positive is someone maybe unwittingly having a contaminated well. I think that background testing should be done. We'd like to see it as part of the scoping process. I will say there are examples that aren't involved in hydrofracking, but most recently in North Brookfield, a driller was drilling a vertical well at 400 feet. His drill bit got stuck, decided to use incredible amounts of compressed air to dislodge the drill bit, and blew out 14 private wells. The caps blew off like geysers. Some wells never recovered. They never received their water back. Others had methane coming out of their taps for months. The company had to buy expensive water treatment systems for these homes, but they and I'm not sure why the DEC doesn't count that as water contamination. You know, it's funny now that I'm talking about it. But it creates. I mean, there are problems, and I think that the DEC would regard that seriously. But I don't know exactly what guarantees. They seem to suggest it in terms of guarantees, but you know, I don't know if there are other actions.
Well, in the testimony that some of us gave to the Standing Committee on Environmental Conservation on the 15th, that I think that issue came up with some of the towns, and there was a mention of small landowners. I think small landowners should become knowledgeable about compulsory integration. In fact, when I think about it more, the supplemental GIS doesn't even mention the impacts of compulsory integration on smaller landowners and their impact on water, and that has an aspect of community character and impacts on community character and environment in general. So that's a key variable that needs to be taken into consideration, and also the whole operationalization of baseline testing. What are you testing for? That's another issue too that needs to be covered, because you know, testing your wells can be very expensive, and if you're spending thousands of dollars to test your well and you're not testing what you should be testing, that also needs to be part of this whole dialogue on the scoping session too. So I'm also providing you food for thought, because it's a document that needs to be thought critically, and the best way to begin is just begin with, you know, your own living and your water, your air, and so forth, and how it impacts you. I don't know if I actually answered the question, but I just want to add more insight to some of these larger themes that we're talking about tonight.
Has anyone done a comprehensive, in-depth historical study on this question in this state, to your knowledge? Yeah, that's kind of what I thought. In respect for our panelists who've had a very long day, I have one final question, but I also want to give you the opportunity, as you answer that question, to end with any remarks that you'd like to leave our audience with. And this is a question about wealth. How much wealth is down there in the Marcellus? How much will the corporations get, the landowners get, the people get?
I'll take a shot at it. Well, in my opinion, there's a lot of wealth down there. It's going to be dictated largely by the market. I think Bruce mentioned this before. Well, we've had a cooling off period, and I think the cooling off period has probably been, I'll somewhat agree with Roger and I'll somewhat disagree with him. I think the cooling off period has been largely economics. I speculated about 2.5 months ago, before Armageddon came in on Wall Street, that perhaps there would be vertical well drilling in my county, where wells would be fracted, vertical wells would be fracted. And then once the supplemental generic environmental impact statement was updated, they would come back and if those wells were productive, they would come back and conduct horizontal fracking. But there is a lot of wealth down there. It's going to be dictated by the economy. I think that they're going to be back, and that's why it's important that this still stays on the radar screen as we move forward. In terms of landowners, landowners are going to have to become very educated on this issue. I think that the signing bonuses have been a way to seduce people into signing documents that are highly complicated, that could compromise their ability to use their land, and might even in some cases compromise their surface rights and the inability to perhaps remortgage their property. So this gets to be very complicated. We had, in fact, Brad Vickers is here tonight. We teamed up with Shenango County Farm Bureau in August and had another session after our June forum focused solely on landowners to get them to really think through their decisions as it relates to their private property. Because the argument that I make is that individuals that make choices eventually have public policy impacts, and those public policy impacts are health, they are infrastructure, and so forth. So that's the way I see it. And on the issues related to infrastructure, which I only covered a microcosm, is to continue addressing how municipalities can recover the impacts of infrastructure to try to gain a little bit more scope in the area of home rule. So there's a multifaceted topic that needs to be addressed, and as you're addressing it, the landscape, the economic landscape, is going to go through ebbs and flows. But there's going to be a motivation to access that resource, and there are going to be different arguments to say why you shouldn't do certain things and why you should. But it's there, and as long as there's going to be significant wealth generated from it, there's going to be significant motivation to tap it.
I think that in terms of talking about wealth, we have to consider, I mean, the question seemed to be directed perhaps toward gas wealth, but we in this area are very wealthy in terms of our freshwater resources. And, you know, what is the value of that wealth? And you know, is it horribly wasteful of that wealth to be using millions of gallons to frack gas wells?
Dr. Colburn, would you like to make some final remarks?
I was sitting here trying to make a list of all the ranchers and people I know who signed these landmen's little contracts when they came to see them for the first time. I'm already up to 15 people, and I have more I could put on this list. Every one of them is very sorry. Their lives are worse. Their health is worse. There's a lot at stake here that people are not taking into consideration. Again, we have two life support systems that we're dependent upon: fresh water and clean air. And the air, especially in the West, we're knowing this now, there are areas where we can no longer add any more increments to contaminate that air. We're reaching the point where we're going to be above the compliance level for human health. And what I didn't mention was I was raised in northern New Jersey, lived many years in Sussex County, and I know your country well. Spent a lot of time in New York and along the Delaware River, upper Delaware River area. I know the land, and I just try to picture what it's going to be like there. The way the land is set up, those beautiful rolling hills, your farmlands. Ozone has plumes that extend over 200 miles. Ozone also penetrates the stomata in the leaves of plants and trees. And in 1990, I helped to write a report for the Office of Technology Assessment, working for Congress, that at every 20 part per billion increase in ozone in the air, you could see a very significant reduction in the production of crops and the replacement of trees, fruit trees especially, and conifers. So we have to weigh this, and I don't think there's enough wealth underground to cover. There's no way to recover what we're going to cause to our life support system. And those things have to come first. I'm sorry. I'm not an economist. I can't speak in terms of economics. I can only speak in terms of what I have seen and what we know in how life exists on Earth. We're closing in on two very important major life support systems, and to me, those are precious. They're far more precious than anything you're going to take from under the ground.
Bruce, did you want to add anything?
I'm not as eloquent as Theo, so I think I'll leave it at that.
Few of us are. All right. I do want to say this. We've been talking about the scoping process. We've been talking about, I guess, inevitability. I've read enough history, seen enough history to know that if people really decide that they're going to be committed to changing something, there's nothing that's impossible. And we can see right now this is not even just about New York State. It's not even just about the United States. Resource extraction, this kind of problem, it's global. I think that given all I've learned, all I've heard, we can find allies in many places, but it's really going to be up to us in this region to take a stand and see what we can't do with that. So with that, I'd like to profoundly thank all our panelists for coming here, some from a very far distance. And I'd like to thank our task force that organized this and the school district, and as well our sponsors and all of you for coming. And I hope I'll see you all again soon. Good night.